47 years is a long time to carry a secret. It is long enough to watch an entire town forget. Long enough to see the posters fade, the searches end, the newspapers move on. It is long enough for a man to marry, raise children, attend church, coach Little League, retire, and grow old in the same county where he buried a 22-year-old woman named Carol Ann Hewitt, and never once be asked a serious question about it. That is not a story about how crime goes unsolved. That is a story about how trust is weaponized, and how a small Virginia community was deceived by the one person in it they never thought to suspect. And it would take nearly 5 decades, a retired detective who kept a case file on his kitchen table for 20 years, and a breakthrough in forensic genealogy that didn't even exist when Carol Ann disappeared, to finally put a name to what happened on the night of October 14, 1977. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was taken, you first have to understand who Carol Ann Hewitt was. In the autumn of 1977, the town of Harlows Creek, Virginia, population just under 3,000, was the kind of place where people still left their back doors unlocked and called it courtesy. It sits in the Blue Ridge foothills, the kind of country where the mountains go purple at dusk and the October air smells like wood smoke and turned soil and something older than memory. Station wagons lined the parking lots of the IGA on Saturday mornings. Families gathered on front porches after supper to watch the evening light fade across the ridge. The town had one diner, one hardware store, a Baptist church that rang its bell at 7 a.m. every Sunday, and a way of operating on the assumption that you knew everyone's name and they knew yours. Carol Ann Hewitt had lived her whole life in that assumption. She was 22 years old that October, a licensed practical nurse at Augusta Memorial Hospital in Waynesboro, 24 miles down the highway. She had graduated from Harlows Creek High in 1973, one of 61 seniors, and her yearbook photo showed a young woman with a wide smile and dark hair she kept braided over one shoulder. Her family had farmed the same 40 acres on County Road 7 since her grandfather built the house in 1941, and Carol Ann was the third of 4 children, the one the family called their steady one. The one who remembered everyone's birthday, who visited her parents every Sunday without being asked, who had recently started putting money aside each paycheck into a savings account she told her mother was for something good. I haven't decided what yet. At Augusta Memorial, the other nurses called her reliable. She worked the overnight rotation 3 times a week and had never missed a shift in 2.5 years. Her supervisor, a woman named Ruth Adkins, would later tell investigators that Carol Ann was the kind of person you didn't notice was essential until she wasn't there. She kept a thermos of coffee in her locker that she shared freely. She had a habit of humming just barely under her breath while she checked vitals, barely audible, just enough to be comforting. She drove a 1972 Dodge Dart, clay brown, with a crack in the passenger side mirror she kept meaning to fix. She had plans for the following spring. She and her closest friend, a woman named Diane Overstreet, had talked about driving down to Myrtle Beach for a week in May, something they'd been talking about since high school and kept putting off. That last ordinary October stretched out ahead of Carol Ann Hewitt the same way it did for everyone in Harlows Creek. Leaf season was turning the ridge every shade of copper and red. The county fair had come and gone the weekend before. There was nowhere Carol Ann was supposed to be that night except home and then back to work by Thursday morning. She never made it home. On the evening of Thursday, October 14, 1977, Carol Ann Hewitt finished her shift at Augusta Memorial. At 11 p.m. records show she clocked out at 11:04. A coworker, a nursing aide named Bobby Triplett, saw her in the parking lot near the side entrance She had her coat buttoned against the cold and her thermos tucked under her arm. They exchanged a few words. Bobby Triplett watched her walk toward the Dodge Dart, then went back inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of Carol Ann Hewitt alive. By 11:20, she would have been on Route 340 heading north. It was a road she had driven hundreds of times, 24 miles, about 30 minutes in regular traffic. By midnight, she had not arrived home. At 12:15 a.m., her father, Raymond Hewitt, tried the hospital. They told him she had left over an hour earlier. Raymond Hewitt got in his truck. At 1:30 a.m., the Rockingham County Sheriff's Department received a call. At 5:47 a.m., on Friday morning, a farmer named Lloyd Schenk, pulling onto Route 340 to check on a fence line, spotted the Dodge Dart in the shallow drainage ditch along the southbound shoulder, approximately 9 miles north of Waynesboro. The engine was off. The driver's door was open. The thermos was on the passenger floorboard. The key was still in the ignition. Carol Ann was not there. The door was open. The engine was off. The thermos was on the floor. Those details would be argued over for the next 4 decades. What was not argued over was this. Carol Ann Hewitt had stopped on Route 340 somewhere between 11:20 p.m. and midnight, and she had not stopped willingly. A search began before sunrise. Volunteers from Harlows Creek and 2 neighboring counties formed lines in the fields along both sides of the highway. The Rockingham County Sheriff's Department brought in dogs. The Virginia State Police were notified. Raymond Hewitt walked every field himself, calling his daughter's name into the cold October air, and the sound of it, neighbors later said, was something they never fully got out of their heads. On the morning of the 3rd day, searchers found Carol Ann Hewitt in a wooded hillside half a mile east of where her car had been found. She had been murdered. The case belonged now to the Rockingham County Sheriff's Department and to a detective named Walter Pruitt, a 14-year veteran who had worked homicides in the valley since 1963. He was 41 years old, methodical, not given to dramatic pronouncements. He would work this case for the next 11 years before he retired, and then he would keep working it on his own time until the day something finally gave. In those first weeks, Walter Pruitt and his team worked every lead the case offered. The victim's car had been processed. There were trace fibers on the passenger's seat that did not match Carol Ann's clothing. A partial boot print was found in the soft shoulder mud near the driver's door. A neighbor reported seeing a dark pickup truck, possibly a Ford, possibly a Chevrolet, possibly neither, parked on the road's shoulder near that stretch, sometime around 11 on the night of October 14th, though the neighbor couldn't be sure of the night, and the truck was never identified. The investigation moved through a methodical sequence. Co-workers were interviewed. Carol Ann's personal relationships were examined. No estranged partner existed. No known threat. No history of conflict. She was, as nearly everyone told investigators, a person who had no enemies. A man from Waynesboro came to investigators' attention in November of 1977, a 28-year-old who had been in the area that night and had no verifiable alibi for the window in question. Pruitt and a colleague interviewed him 3 times. Records show they considered him a serious suspect for nearly 6 months. Then a witness came forward in the spring of 1978, placing the man at a bar in Staunton until well after midnight on the night Carol Ann disappeared. His name was removed from active consideration. The trace fibers from the passenger seat went to the state lab. Results came back inconclusive. The boot print cast was filed with the evidence and stored. By the summer of 1978, the active investigation had narrowed and then, quietly, stalled what the official investigation was doing in those months, Raymond Hewitt could not afford to wait on. He posted a $500 reward, a significant sum for a farm family in 1978, and kept it posted for years. Carol Ann's mother, Edna Hewitt, kept Carol Ann's bedroom exactly as it had been. She did not change the bedspread. She did not move the books. She told a neighbor that she needed there to be something for Carol Ann to come back to, and when a kinder neighbor gently told her that wasn't going to happen, Edna said she understood. But she kept the room the same anyway. The case did not break in 1979, or 1980, or in any year that followed for a very long time. By 1984, 7 years had passed. Carol Ann Hewitt's name appeared on a list of Rockingham County cold cases that the Sheriff's Department submitted to the Virginia State Police for a regional review. No new leads were generated. By 1990, 13 years had gone by. The highway where her car had been found had been resurfaced twice. The drainage ditch was deeper now. The wooded hillside where she had been found had grown thicker, the scrub and young trees filling in the space between the older oaks, until you would not have been able to find the place easily anymore without knowing where to look. Walter Pruitt had retired from the Sheriff's Department in 1988, but had taken the case file home with him. He was not supposed to. He did it anyway. The file lived on his kitchen table, and then when his wife grew tired of looking at it, in a box in the room they called the study. He pulled it out regularly. He reread the interviews. He looked at the timeline. He thought about the truck nobody could quite identify, and the fibers nobody could quite match, and the 14-hour window when someone drove or rode on Route 340 without being noticed by anyone except a neighbor who wasn't sure of the night. The Hewitt family had its own rituals. Every October 14th, Raymond and Edna drove to the stretch of Route 340 where the Dodge Dart had been found and left flowers at the roadside. They did this every year. They did not miss a year. When Raymond Hewitt's health declined in the early 1990s, Edna and Carol Ann's younger sister, Patricia, carried on the ritual. When Patricia had children of her own, she brought them. The flowers changed, sometimes chrysanthemums, sometimes zinnias from the garden, but the date never varied and the place never changed. By 2001, 24 years had passed. Edna Hewitt was in her 70s, and her health was not good. She told Patricia that she did not expect to know the answer before she died. "But I believe someone knows," she said. "I've always believed that." Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Carol Ann. The case had been cold for nearly 3 decades when something finally shifted. And it did not begin where anyone expected. It began in 2019, 42 years after Carol Ann Hewitt disappeared from Route 340. When a forensic specialist at the Virginia Department of Forensic Science named Dana Ferris was reviewing a backlog of biological evidence from unsolved cases submitted under a cold case initiative. The program had been running since 2016, systematically re-examining biological samples from cases where advances in DNA technology had made new analysis possible. Among the evidence in the Carol Ann Hewitt file, a biological sample recovered during the original 1977 investigation, preserved and stored in the state's evidence system for 4 decades. Dana Ferris submitted the sample for genetic genealogy analysis, a process that works by uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people look up their family history, and tracing distant relative matches back to identify an unknown contributor. It is painstaking, month-long work, It requires building family trees backward from people who have no idea they are connected to a crime. On a Tuesday morning in February 2020, Dana Ferris received results that included a cluster of partial matches on 2 different genealogy platforms, pointing to the same regional family network, a tight cluster of surnames rooted in the Shenandoah Valley, in Rockingham and Augusta counties. She called the cold case investigator assigned to the review, a detective named Marcus Webb of the Virginia State Police, whose office was in Harrisonburg. "I need you to see something," she told him. Webb drove down that afternoon. The genealogy trail led through 18 months of careful legal cross-referencing and conventional detective work to a single man. His name was Gerald Roy Combs. He was 71 years old. He had lived in Augusta County his entire life, 12 miles from where Carol Ann Hewitt had worked the overnight shift. In 1977, he had been 27 years old and had worked as a mechanic at a shop in Waynesboro, a shop that sat 4 blocks from the employee parking lot at Augusta Memorial Hospital. He had a wife of 43 years, 3 adult children, 6 grandchildren. He coached youth baseball in the 1990s. He attended Calvary Baptist Church in Waynesboro, where he had been a member since 1982. His neighbors, when later interviewed, described him in terms that echoed each other: quiet, steady, neighborly. Kept his property up. Remembered to wave. On a cold morning in August 2021, investigators submitted Gerald Combs's DNA, obtained legally through discarded material during a surveillance operation, to the forensic lab. The match came back confirmed. Gerald Roy Combs's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from the Carol Ann Hewitt homicide investigation in 1977. On September 4, 2021, at 7:22 in the morning, 3 Virginia State Police vehicles turned onto a residential street in Fishersville, Virginia, and stopped in front of a gray colonial house with a well-kept flower bed and an American flag on the front porch. Gerald Roy Combs answered the door in a flannel robe. He looked at the badges. He said nothing. He was arrested for the murder of Carol Ann Hewitt. The community's response was not disbelief. It was something worse: slow, stunned recognition. People in Waynesboro and Harlows Creek and the surrounding valley began remembering things they had not thought about for decades: that Gerald Combs had worked near the hospital, that he had driven that stretch of Route 340, that he had once or twice in the 1970s shown up at a social event or a church gathering where he and Carol Ann Hewitt might have been in the same room. The picture that assembled itself was not of a stranger. It was of a neighbor who had hidden in plain sight for 4 years behind a life he had built with deliberate normalcy. At the Augusta County Circuit Court in 2022, Gerald Roy Combs was charged with first-degree murder. He offered no statement at arraignment. Court documents show that during processing, when a detective asked him a question about the night of October 14, 1977, he looked at the wall and said nothing. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The case proceeded. In April of 2023, following a change of representation and a review of the DNA evidence, Gerald Combs entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that the evidence against him was sufficient for conviction while declining to formally admit guilt. He was sentenced to 40 years in the Virginia Department of Corrections, with credit for time served. He was 73 years old at sentencing. He would not likely serve the full term. The sentence was imperfect, and the Hewitt family knew it. But the name had been spoken in open court. The DNA had been confirmed in public record. The secret Gerald Combs had carried for 47 years had been pulled into the light, and there was no longer anything he could do about that. There is a stretch of Route 340, 9 miles north of Waynesboro, where wildflowers grow in the drainage ditch along the southbound shoulder in the summer, and the mountains go purple at dusk in October. Patricia Hewitt Torres, Carol Ann's younger sister, still drives there on October 14th every year. She has done it for decades, first with her parents, then with her own children, and now with her grandchildren, who are old enough to understand what they are doing, but still young enough to find the quiet of the roadside heavy with something they can't quite name. Patricia told a reporter from the Waynesboro News-Virginian after the sentencing that she felt peace she had not expected to feel. "We didn't need him to be sorry," she said. "We just needed it to stop being a mystery." Edna Hewitt died in 2008, 13 years before Gerald Combs's arrest. She never knew. Raymond Hewitt died in 1996. He never knew either. That fact sits heavily on the family, and there is no tidy way around it. Justice arrived. It arrived too late for Carol Ann's parents, who deserved to see it most. Walter Pruitt, the detective who had carried the case file home from the sheriff's department in 1988, was 86 years old when Gerald Combs was arrested. His daughter called to tell him. He did not say much. He had kept that file for 33 years after he retired, and what he said when he heard was simply, "Good." What this case represents is something that this niche tries to say in different ways across hundreds of videos. The past is not as sealed as it seems. The era of genetic genealogy has reopened cases that 2 generations of investigators had given up on. Biological evidence that sat in a Virginia evidence locker since 1977 contained a truth that neither degraded nor altered. It simply waited. It waited for the technology to catch up. How many evidence lockers across this country hold something similar? How many families have been placing flowers at the side of a road for decades, not knowing that the answer already exists, already sits in a box somewhere, waiting for a Tuesday morning when someone decides to look again? Carol Ann Hewitt wanted to go to Myrtle Beach in the spring of 1978. She had a savings account for something good. She hummed barely under her breath while she checked vitals on the overnight rotation. She drove a clay-brown Dodge Dart with a cracked passenger mirror and a thermos she shared freely. She was 22 years old, and she had her whole life ahead of her. And Gerald Roy Combs took it from her on a dark stretch of Route 340 in October of 1977, and then walked back into his ordinary life and let her family carry the silence alone for 47 years. The silence is over now. Carol Ann Hewitt has her answer. It came late. It came 47 years late. But truth, however long it is buried, eventually finds a way to the surface. That is not sentiment. That is what this case proved. What do you think about the role that genetic genealogy is playing in reopening cold cases like this one? Are there limits to how it should be used, or does justice always justify the method? And for a case that went unsolved for nearly half a century, do you feel that the Alford plea and the sentence Gerald Combs received was justice for Carol Ann and her family? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Justice found Carol Ann Hewitt after 47 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and there are more solved cold cases waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.